Hello. Great. This is Anatomy and Physiology, Chapter 46, Female Reproductive System. This will be our last chapter for this semester. So this is spring of 2020. All right, let's get started. Okay, looking at an overview, we're going to list the essential and accessory sex organs of the female reproductive system and give a generalized function of each. We're going to explain the clinical importance of the perineum during childbirth. We're going to describe the structure of the ovaries and explain the steps in the development of mature ova from ovarian follicles. Then we're going to identify the two functions of the ovaries. So with regard to the uterus, we're going to provide details of its wall layers, size, shape, cavities, blood supply, and ligaments. We're going to locate it in the pelvic cavity, compare its position with that abnormal position of retroflexion. Then we're going to identify its functions. Then we're going to discuss the location, structure, divisions, and functions of the uterine tubes, also called the fallopian tubes. So let's look at the functions of the female reproductive system. One of the functions is to produce offspring and thereby ensure continuity of the genetic code. Another is to produce gametes that may unite with a male gamete to form the first cell of an offspring. And a gamete is half of, it's the haploid chromosome makeup of a genetic makeup. So all our cells are diploid, which means it has two sets. A gamete only has one set. And so that's the set that it will contribute to the new offspring. So the female gamete is the egg, and the male gamete is the sperm. So the female gamete has 23 chromosomes, and while all the other cells in your body have 46 chromosomes, one set from your mother, one set of 23 from your mother, a set of 23 from your father. So another function of the female reproductive system is to provide protection and nutrition to developing offspring for up to several years after conception. Here, the essential organs are the gonads. The gonads in the female reproductive are the ovaries. Then you have accessory organs. Accessory organs would be the ducts and modified duct structures, such as the uterine tubes, which are also called fallopian tubes, the uterus itself, and the vagina. Then we have the external genitalia, which is the vulva. Additional glands, such as the mammary glands, that secrete milk as well. Here's where we have the ovaries, so where the eggs produce. This is a sagittal section, which means it's cut from the side, looking in. This is the uterine tube, also called the fallopian tube. This is where the eggs are produced in the ovaries, and they actually travel down the uterine tube. And while they're in the uterine tube, this is typically where they're fertilized. And they travel, if they get fertilized, then they get embedded into the uterus. And the uterus is what nurtures it. And this is where the baby grows. And then this is the cervix from the uterus. This is the vagina itself. And then this is the vaginal canal. This is the opening that we see from the outside, but the majority of the vagina is inside. And this is where the sperm actually comes in here, and the sperm travels through the uterus, and then it goes up through the fallopian tube or uterine tube, and in this area here is where the eggs typically are fertilized. But once they get fertilized, they come back down and they get embedded into the uterus. So let's look at the female perineum. So the perineum is a skin-covered region between the vaginal orifice and the anus. And the female perineum extends from the pubic symphysis, that's on the front side or anterior, and it extends to the coccyx on the posteriorly. So it's divided into the urogenital triangle and the anal triangle. So this is the area that may be torn during childbirth. So here's the female perineum, this area all here, and extends from the pubic symphysis on the anterior side and the coccyx on the posterior side. And so the perineum, this is the area between the vagina and anus, and as the baby's born, sometimes the baby stretches the vagina so much that it tears, and it may tear this whole region between the vagina and the anus, and that's where the doctor will cut this to make the opening bigger. That's a episiotomy, because it's better to have it cut, nice clean cut, than to actually have it torn. It's harder to fix. So let's look at the ovaries. Ovaries are nodular glands that have a puckered, uneven surface after puberty. The ovaries are located on each side of the uterus. And also this is where we can talk about an ectopic pregnancy. So ectopic pregnancy is a development of the fetus in a location other than the uterus. Typically when we talk about an ectopic pregnancy, it's usually in the uterine tube or fallopian tube, that after an egg is fertilized, if it embeds in the wall of the fallopian tube or uterine tube and starts to grow there, that's an ectopic pregnancy. It can be fertilized in the uterine tube, but then it needs to travel to the uterus, embed in the wall of the uterus, and there the baby can grow, and that's where it can be nurtured. Ectopic pregnancy can be life-threatening for a female because the uterine tube is not set to handle the growth of a baby. This is the close-up of the organs of the female reproductive system. Here's the ovary with the eggs inside. The egg is released and it goes into the uterine tube. This is the body of the uterus, and this is what they call the ampulla of the uterus. This portion here. This is the portion where the egg typically is fertilized. Then it goes down and it meets the uterus, and the fertilized egg will embed in the wall of the uterus. And then here's the cervical canal with the cervix. This whole thing is the cervix, the cervical canal, and then it leads to the vagina. So you can see it on this side. And it's not cut open. The ovary releases the egg. The egg goes into the uterine tube, and this is the ampulla of the uterine tube in this area here. This is typically where the egg is fertilized, goes into the uterus, embeds in the uterus when it's fertilized, and then when it's time for delivery, the cervix opens up and allows the baby to be expelled into the vagina. So we won't worry about the microscopic structure of the ovaries, but you can look through those if you want. Here's the microscopic features. This is microscopic as well. But ovulation, know that ovulation is release of an ovum at the end of oogenesis. So ovulation is when the egg is released from the ovary. Functions of the ovaries. First off, they produce ova, which are female gametes, which are the female eggs. That's a big function of the ovaries. So oogenesis process results in formation of a mature egg. So oogenesis, it's the maturation area for eggs. The ovaries also function as endocrine organs. So they secrete the female sex hormones. estrogens, and progesterones. The uterus is a pear-shaped structure with two main parts. First, it has the body and the cervix. The body is the main portion of the uterus. The cervix is the opening into the vagina. And then in the body, you have a fundus, which is the bulging upper part of the body. The uterus is located in the pelvic cavity between the urinary bladder and the rectum. So the body of the uterus lies flexed over the bladder. And so a lot of women, when they say when they get pregnant, they can't hold as much urine. That's because the baby, as it gets bigger and the uterus gets bigger, it presses against the bladder. And some women have incontinence because of that as well. The cervix points downward and backward. So it joins the vagina at a right angle. And so several ligaments hold the uterus in place, but allow some movement. Here's a sagittal section again of a uterus with vagina. So here's the uterus. It's mostly muscular. You notice this uterine cavity is very small until a baby starts to develop. This is the cervix, which is the opening of the uterus, and this is the cervical canal. And then it leads to the vagina. This is the vagina. And in the vagina, you have what they call a posterior fornix. There's a blind end, and this is the anterior fornix. And then this is the vagina. So as a female is penetrated and the sperm is released, the sperm travels. It goes in through the uterus, and then it leaves out through the uterine tube, and it goes to the uterine tube, and that's where it fertilizes. If an egg is present, fertilizes the egg. You don't have to know the uterine ligaments. I'm not going to test you on that, but there are 8. 2 of them are called broad ligaments, 2 uterosacral ligaments. They have a posterior ligament, anterior ligament, and 2 round ligaments. So the walls of the uterus. So the walls are composed of 3 layers. I want you to know these. The endometrium, which is the inner layer. The endometrium is a layer that gets sloughed off during menses or menstruation. This is the layer that gets left off, endometrium. Endometrium is also a layer that will nurture a fertilized egg. So a fertilized egg, after it's fertilized, it makes it to the uterus and it embeds in the endometrium. When there's no fertilized egg, then the endometrium will slough off. And that's the layer that you see in the menstrual cycle. Then you have the myometrium, which is the middle layer. Myo is muscle. So this is the muscle layer. This is a very big muscle. The uterus is made up mostly of myometrium. And then you have the perimetrium, which is the external layer. And it just mentions that the endometrium is composed of compact, spongy, and basal layers. So the cavities of the uterus are small because of the thickness of the uterine walls. So when we looked at the uterus, we saw that the cavity, the empty space on the inside is small until it needs to expand. It has a great capacity to expand. Okay. Blood supply is received from the uterine, ovarian, and vaginal arteries. So the functions of the uterus. The uterus is part of the reproductive tract. That's the tract is it's a connection between the outside world, the vagina, and the inside, the ovaries and the releasing of the eggs. And so It permits sperm to go up toward the uterine tubes. So the uterus is part of the tract that directs sperm to where the eggs are so that they can be fertilized. Then if conception occurs, the offspring develops in the uterus. So it's a tract to let sperm in, and then it also is where the offspring will develop. So the embryo is supplied with nutrients by endometrial glands until a placenta can be produced. The placenta is an organ that permits the exchange of materials between offspring's blood and the maternal blood. So the myometrial contractions occur during gestation. So that's during delivery. So myometrial contractions, so the muscle contractions of the uterus, that's what occurs when you're going to deliver. Location of the uterine tubes. The uterine tubes are attached to the uterus at its upper outer angles. They lie in the upper free margin of the broad ligaments, extend upward and outward toward the sides of the pelvis, and then curve downward and backward and open up at the ovaries. The uterine tubes, they have a mucosal lining that's directly continuous with the peritoneum lining of the pelvic cavity. You can get inflammation of the uterine tubes that can lead to scarring and partial or complete closure of the lumen in the uterine tubes. Now, where you get inflammation is typically in response to an infection. And the infections that we typically see in the uterine tubes are if someone has a sexually transmitted disease. So if someone has a sexually transmitted disease and that disease travels and gets to the uterine tube, it can cause inflammation. And as the body's trying to heal itself, you're going to get scarring until the body fights it off. And so what we find with people that have a lot of sexually transmitted diseases, we find that their fallopian tubes or the uterine tubes, you get a lot of scarring. And so if they do get pregnant, where they actually have the egg is fertilized in the fallopian tube, the scarring makes it harder for the egg to leave. And so the egg actually implants on the walls of the uterine tube. And that's where we get ectopic pregnancies. And that could potentially be life-threatening. And typically those implanted embryos do not survive. And then each uterine tube has 3 divisions. The isthmus, which is the medial third, that's it's broken up into thirds. So that's the part that's closest to the midline. The ampulla is an intermediate dilated portion. That's the portion that's that tube in between the uterus and the ovaries. Then you have the infundibulum. That's a funnel-shaped terminal part that lies just above the ovary and opens into the pelvic cavity. So the infundibulum is that it's like a funnel shape that surrounds the ovary. This is just an electron microscope graph of sperm. This is the wall of the uterine tube, the cilia. Okay, now we're going to talk about the menstrual cycle, menopause, and lactation. So first, let's talk about the vagina. The vagina is a tubular organ located between the rectum, the urethra, and the bladder. Remember, most of the vagina is inside, or it's where we can't see it. And so that's why it talks about it's between the bladder and the rectum and the urethra. The structure of it, it's a collapsible tube capable of great distension. The anterior wall is shorter than the posterior wall, And then the hymen is a mucous membrane that typically forms a border around the vagina. Functions of the vagina. Vagina is the lower portion of the birth canal, and the lining of the vagina lubricates and stimulates the penis during sexual intercourse. So the vagina transports blood and tissue shed during menstruation to the exterior. The structure of the vulva. The the pudendum contains the mons pubis, labia majora, labia minora, glans clitoris, urinary meatus, vaginal orifice, and the greater vestibular glands. So the vulva is the external portion of the vagina. The vagina is a hollow tube, and most of it you cannot see. But the portion you see, it's called the vulva. It's the vulva of the vagina. Most people, when they talk about the vagina, they think they're talking about the vagina, but they're just typically talking about the vulva because it's what they can see. So the functions in the vulva, the mons pubis and labia protect the clitoris and the vestibule. So the clitoris, it contains sensory receptors that send information to the sexual response area of the brain. And the vaginal orifice is the boundary between the internal and external genitalia. So the vulva is the external genitalia, and most of the vagina is the internal genitalia. So this is the vulva. This is the part that we can see, the vaginal vulva. Once again, here's the foreskin, which is called the prepuce, that covers the clitoris. There's the clitoris in the middle. And then you have the labia minora, the inside. Labia majora is this part out here. This is the part that is usually it's pulled together so you cannot see the vulva until you pull back the labia majora. In labia minora, here's the opening to the urethra, which is the external urinary meatus. And then they have little openings here, which is opening to the skin gland. The skin gland is comparable to a male prostate. And when we hear someone or people hear, there's some women that have ejaculate when they actually have an orgasm. And we're finding that that comes from substance that's produced from the skin gland, as well as substance that is similar to urine. So it empties the bladder and it's mixed with the skin gland production. This is the vestibule of the vulva, and then this is the orifice of the vagina. This is the opening going into the internal genitalia. And this is the area that is covered with the hymen. And then this is only broken when something penetrates it. And so when you talk about a virgin has her hymen intact, this is like she has not introduced anything into her vagina internal genitalia. And this is the area down here between the anus and the vagina that potentially will have a episiotomy. This shows the vulva more specifically, and what I want you to understand here is that this is the clitoris, which is comparable to the male penis, the head of the male penis. And then this is the foreskin. It has a male foreskin, a prepuce. And then this is the corpus cavernosum, like with the male penis and the corpus cavernosum. And then, but with the male penis, it actually encircles the urethra. With female, it is separate. And the majority of the clitoris cannot be seen. The only part that we see externally is the clitoris, but the clitoris actually goes back and down. all of this is part of the clitoris. And so the majority of the female clitoris is not seen. The majority of the male penis is seen. And once again, you have the orifice of the vagina, you have the hymen, and then you have these are the skin glands, and they have the openings around the external urethra. And we talk about the female reproductive cycle, talk about menstruation, its outward changes to the endometrium. So menstruation is the outward changes to the endometrium. So it's the sloughing off of the inner layer of the inner layer of the uterus. The ovarian cycle, the ovaries at time of birth contains oocyte and primary follicles in which the meiotic process has been suspended. So the female, when she's born, has all of the eggs that she's ever going to have. Eggs are developed they're placed in the ovaries before birth. So by the time a female is born, she has all of the eggs that she will ever have in her life. The ovarian cycle actually continues to mature the eggs. They continue to go through the meiotic process and have ovulation of a few eggs at a time, so that they could actually be potentially fertilized. And that's so at the beginning of menstruation each month, several of the ovocytes presume meiosis, and then typically one, sometimes multiple eggs are released or ovulated. So meiosis stops again just before the cells release during ovulation. So after ovulation, the ruptured cells form the corpus luteum. And here's this is an ovary, and this is a ovulation of an egg. So the endometrial or menstrual cycle is divided into 4 phases. You have menses, which is the actual sloughing off of the inner lining of the uterus. Then you have post-menstrual or pre-ovulatory phase. So post-menstrual, after your menstrual cycle, but it's before the ovaries ovulate, before they release any eggs. Then you have ovulation. That's where the eggs are released from the ovaries. And then you have premenstrual or luteal phase. So premenstrual is before it sloughs off again. So it's a cycle. So you have premenstrual. So after ovulation and then during the premenstrual is the time where if the egg gets fertilized, then this process is stopped. The egg gets implanted in the uterus, and then you have fertilization. But if the egg is not fertilized during this premenstrual or luteal phase, then you go through the sloughing off period, or the menses, and that's where the blood starts flowing and the tissue from the inner lining of the uterus, that's menses. And then after the blood flows, then you have postmenstrual or pre-ovulatory phase, and then it goes through it again. It's pre-ovulatory, it's getting ready, the ovary is getting ready to send out another egg, and then you ovulate again. So that's what I want you to understand regarding this menstrual cycle, the 4 phases. So control of female reproductive cycle, you have cyclical changes in the ovaries that result from changes in the gonadotrophin secreted by the anterior pituitary gland. So levels of estrogens increases, hits a peak, and causes ovulation. So the ovaries are producing the estrogen at a certain peak, and then ovulation occurs. And so that's called an estrogen surge. And so The estrogen is stimulated by luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary gland. So you have LH that causes estrogen to be released from the ovaries, and the uh, and then you have ovulation. So this is the this is the anterior pituitary. This is the gonadotropin. So it produces FSH and LH. But let's just talk about the LH. The anterior pituitary produces LH. The LH first stimulates completion of follicle and oocyte growth. So it stimulates the ovaries to finish out the ovaries secrete estrogen by the follicles. Then it stimulates ovulation, which causes mature follicle to rupture, expelling the egg. And then you get luteinization, causes formation of corpus luteum from ruptured follicles. So after ovulation, a corpus luteum that was surrounding the egg is formed, and then that corpus luteum starts producing their own progesterone and estrogen. And the corpus luteum produces its own estrogen and progesterone. And now it's ready, that egg is ready to actually be fertilized, and then it will continue the process and stimulate the uterus to grow and to get ready for implantation. So control of ovarian changes. The LH, which is from the anterior pituitary, brings about the following changes. It completes the growth of the pre-ovulatory follicles, sets in motion processes that break down connective tissue of the ovarian cortex, prompts formation of corpus luteum, which is a temporary endocrine gland. The endocrine gland does not have any ducts. So once the corpus luteum starts producing progesterone and estrogen, it's considered an endocrine gland. It releases substance into the blood. So blood levels of progesterone rises after the LH surge. So let's look at the control of changes in the uterus and gonadotropin secretion. So effects on uterus after increasing estrogen levels. So this is the post-menstrual phase. You have proliferation of endometrial cells, growth of endometrial glands and spiral arteries of endometrium, increased water content, and myometrial contractions. So this is post-menstrual phase. So that's after the menses. Then what happens is when we get more estrogen, the uterus starts building up its internal walls again. All of this that it's doing, where you have proliferation means growth of the endometrial cells, and growth of the glands. All of this is getting ready for another fertilized egg to implant. So once it's sloughed off from the previous one, it's getting ready for the next one. And then the effects of uterus on increasing progesterone levels. You have the endometrial gland secretion, prepares for endometrium implantation, increased water content of endometrium, and decreased myometrial contractions. So once again, the estrogen and progesterone get the uterus ready for implantation of a fertilized egg. And then the gonadotropin secretion, which is the gonadotropin, is the LH, the FSH that's produced by the um, anterior pituitary, is controlled by both negative and positive feedback mechanisms, which I'm not going to go into the specifics with those. And this just talks about that whole sequence. So, importance of the female reproductive cycles. Well, for the ovarian cycle, the primary function is to produce ova at regular intervals. Secondary function of the ovarian cycle is to regulate the endometrial cycle through the estrogen and progesterone. Endometrial, that's endometrial lining of the uterus. So the endometrial cycle makes the uterus suitable for implantation of a new embryo. So the uterus gets ready for the implantation of a new embryo. That's endometrial cycle. That's the menstrual cycle. That's the lining of the uterus, getting it ready for implantation of new embryo. When a new embryo is not fertilized, it's the process to slough off that endometrium and then get it ready for get ready so a new egg could potentially be fertilized and implanted. So the cyclical nature of the reproductive system and the fact that fertilization occurs within 24 hours after ovulation means that a woman is fertile only a few days of each month. So that means that after ovulation, the egg, if it's going to be fertilized, typically is fertilized within 24 hours of fertilization. So what ends up happening is the sperm, let's see, one second. Okay, let's go back a little bit. Oh, here we go. Okay, so when the sperm is deposited and the sperm comes up and makes its way through the uterus and up into the ampulla of the uterine tube or fallopian tube, it sits and waits. The sperm sits and waits. There are millions and millions, hundreds of millions of sperm that are produced upon each ejaculation. And so they sit and wait in the uterine tube. They wait, and they can wait days until the ovary ovulates and releases the egg. Once the egg is released, if sperm are there or it meets a sperm in this area, then it gets fertilized, then the egg travels and implants into the uterine wall. If there is no fertilization, then the egg, once it's released, it takes about 24 hours for it to travel down this area. And if it has not been fertilized by the time it gets here, then we start the process of this starts to slough off. The egg is not implanted and it sloughs off. And the sloughing is the blood that you see that goes through the cervix, goes through the vagina and out. And that's the menstrual flow. Then after the post-menstrual, after the menstrual flow, it's not flowing anymore, then you have the anterior pituitary produces LH, which the LH stimulates the ovary to produce estrogen. The estrogen causes the uterine endometrial lining to grow, proliferate, and get ready for a new egg. And then you have the estrogen surge, and it produces ovulation. And at the same time, it releases progesterone as well. Progesterone further increases the proliferation of the endometrial lining. So remember, this is the endometrial lining of the uterus. And then the egg is ovulated, and it goes through. It takes 24 hours to go the travel from the where it came into the uterine tube, and it travels down. If it gets fertilized, then you have implantation. If it doesn't get fertilized, then you have the process starts over again. Okay. Okay, let's see. So that's where we talk about the cyclical nature of the reproductive system, and the fact that fertilization occurs within 24 hours after ovulation, meaning that a woman is fertile only a few days of each month. As an interesting side note, when some students would ask, well, if a woman can actually have twins from two different men, and the answer to that is yes. because, let's go back. So you see some of these pictures of women that have a baby that looks black and a baby that looks white, and they're twins. They actually are delivered at the same time. Because how twins kind of work is, let's say this ovary produces one egg, and let's say this ovary produces an egg. Typically, only one of the eggs is has the ability to be fertilized. But some women, you have an egg that's produced over here, an egg that's produced over here, or you can even have two eggs on one side. Let's say you have an egg over here, an egg over here. But let's say before the eggs actually were ovulated, let's say this woman had sex with a man that was a black man, and now the sperm goes up and the sperm goes up. So there's millions, hundreds of millions of sperm. Some of them go this way, some of them go this way. And so the sperm go up and they're sitting here waiting for ovulation, sitting here waiting for ovulation. Let's say the next day she has sex with another man who's a white man. She has sex, unprotected, and now the sperm go up, and now his sperm are in each uterine tube. Now you have a situation where you have sperm from two men, and actually you could have sperm from multiple men in the uterine tube waiting for for ovulation. So you can have all these sperm waiting around for ovulation. When the ovaries actually ovulate and the egg is released, now the egg is making its way down, and if the sperm from the white man fertilizes this egg, and the sperm from the black man fertilizes this egg, then the eggs are implanted in the uterine wall, the endometrium of the uterine wall, and they implant in different areas. And now the uterus starts nurturing both of the babies. And so this is a baby from a black father. This is a baby from white father. So they're developed in the same uterus at the same time, and they're delivered at the same time. They are twins. They're not identical twins. So they don't have the exact same genetic makeup. They are fraternal twins. They were born at the same time, but they have the genetic makeup from the mother and the genetic makeup from each individual father. And that genetic makeup from the father is completely different. Interesting point. So yes, twins can have two different fathers. Now you know why. Okay, so let's talk about infertility and use of fertility drugs. Infertility is defined as failure to conceive after 1 year of regular unprotected intercourse, caused by a variety of medical and environmental lifestyle factors. Fertility drugs and other assisted reproductive procedures such as in vitro fertilization and supra-ovulation are available. So menarche, menopause, menstrual flow begins at puberty, and it varies according to race, nutrition, health, and heredity. And so menstrual flow occurs for about 3 decades, about 30 years. So it usually ends around ages 45 to 50. Kind of depends on when you started your menstrual flow. The estrogen concentration decreases dramatically after menopause. Menopause is no menstrual flow for 1 year. Then you are considered postmenopausal. Menopausal is the stoppage of menstrual flow. So premenopausal is just before you can stop your menstrual flow. And when you're going through menopause, that's like you have sporadic menstrual flow. Some people that are going through menopause, their hormones are going out of whack all over the place. Sometimes they have enough hormones to actually cause menstrual flow. they can still get pregnant during menopause because the egg, if it's fertilized, could potentially get implanted, but the menstrual flow is sporadic. And then when you get to the place where you don't have a menstrual flow for a year, then you're considered postmenopausal. That means that you are no longer going to have, you're no longer participating in the ovarian cycle and the endometrial cycle. And so you don't have sloughing off of the endometrial wall and you're not ovulating any longer. It's postmenopausal. These are the, shows the the estrogen. The estrogen is produced, this is the age in years. And so you see at puberty, you start getting gonadotropins, LH secretion. Uh, you get you get increase of the estrogens because the gonadotropins actually start to increase. They peak around this time, and that's usually when we go through puberty. So usually females go through puberty, can go through puberty as early as 7, but usually about 13, 14. And then you start getting these increases of estrogen levels. So estrogen is very high. You can see between 10 and then you see it goes to 50. The estrogen levels are peaking around 30. Then they start going down. Estrogen levels are starting to go down. And this is where you get the premenopausal, menopausal, and postmenopausal. This is when the estrogen levels are starting to go down. Then the gonadotropins are increasing, trying to get more estrogen produced. And so the hormones from the anterior pituitary are increasing, but the estrogen levels are decreasing. The ovaries are running out of steam. And so they can't be stimulated anymore at a certain point. And then their levels are very low. And then eventually the gonadotropin levels start going down as well. This, where we have all this fluctuation of hormones, is where you go through the menopause and the changes that you see associated with menopause. So you look at the breasts lie over the pectoral muscles and are connected by fascia. The estrogens and progesterones control breast development as well. So breast size is determined by the amount of fat around the glandular tissue. So size is not related to ability to produce milk. Size is an indication of the amount of adipose tissue or fat that a woman has around the glandular tissue, which can produce milk. So you see, this is the glandular tissue, and here's the pectoral muscle, and then it's just how much fat do you have around that glandular tissue. So this is where one of the ducts that produce milk. So these are the cells that surround that duct. And you see each cell will produce a little bit of milk, and that milk will collect, and then it'll go through this ductule. And so inside here are the cells that produce the milk, and they go through the duct, through this ductule, and it has these little lactiferous sinuses that collect the milk. And then when the baby starts to suck, he's able to extract the milk from these lactiferous sinuses and is able to drink. And these, when the sucking begins, then you get more production of milk. So structure of the breast, each consists of several lobes separated by septa. Lobes consist of several lobules composed of connective tissue embedded with pouches of milk-secreting cells. The lactiferous duct from each lobe converges toward the nipple. And the nipples are surrounded by the areola. Functions of the mammary glands is lactation. So mechanism of lactation, the ovarian hormones, which are the estrogen and progesterone, make breasts structurally ready to secrete milk. And so shedding of the placenta cuts off a major source of estrogens. So then we get prolactin stimulates lactation after delivery. So oxytocin stimulates the myeloid epithelial cells to eject milk. So after delivery, well, before delivery, the placenta produces a lot of estrogen, and that's where when a lot of estrogen is produced, then the breasts enlarge and they start generating milk, getting ready for to take care of the baby. When the placenta is cut off, then prolactin stimulates milk production or lactation, and you have production of oxytocin. So then sucking at the nipples stimulates the anterior pituitary to secrete prolactin. The prolactin stimulates the alveoli to secrete milk. So sucking stimulates the anterior pituitary to produce prolactin, which stimulates milk. It also stimulates the posterior pituitary to secrete oxytocin. Oxytocin stimulates the breast alveoli to eject the milk. And so into ducts where the baby can remove it. So a female, as long as they're suckling after she delivers, will continue to have the anterior pituitary secreting prolactin, secreting milk, and the posterior pituitary produce oxytocin to eject the milk. So as long as they're suckling, then a woman can pretty much on an ongoing basis secrete milk. And that's where actually a lot of slave owners, they would have females that would have babies, and what they would do is they would continue to stimulate the females after they have babies. They continue to stimulate their breast so they can produce milk. Then when the slave owner wife would have a baby, a lot of times they would have the nanny slave that would come and feed the baby. And so the nanny would be the one that gets up in the middle of the night and feeds the baby by letting the baby suck on her milk so that the wife would not have to do that. And so a woman could not have a baby for a long period of time, but because the slave owner's wife would have babies, that woman would be able to produce milk, and she was nurturing the children. So some advantages of breast milk: you get nutrients, and you also get passive immunity. Those are antibodies that are in the mother's body, are transferred into the colostrum and the milk. Colostrum is the first production of milk that the baby gets, and it's full of a lot of antibodies because the baby immune system is not developed enough to produce their own antibodies, so they get antibodies from the mother's milk. And so early on, that's where they get their immunity, from antibodies that are given to them from their mother. And then you get emotional bonding between mother and child. So you have some disorders of the female reproductive system. You have hormonal and menstrual disorders like amenorrhea. This means no menstrual cycle. Dysfunctional uterine bleeding. That's where you may get too much or too little menstrual flow. Premenstrual syndrome. So before you go through menstrual cycle, you may actually have a lot of different changes that are abnormal. And it's every month you have someone may have certain features and factors that they have that their body goes through. This premenstrual syndrome. Infection and inflammation, so pelvic inflammatory disease, vaginitis, candidiasis, and you can have tumors or related conditions, polycystic ovary syndrome, fibromyalgia, endometriosis. Then you can have breast cancer and cancer of the uterus. All right, that's it. I tried to go a little bit faster so you guys can, don't want to hold you too long, but let's see, wanted to say that I've really enjoyed our time. I kind of miss being able to be there with you all during this time of online teaching, but hopefully you learned some anatomy physiology and your time put in will be rewarded. All right. So let's go over what's going to be on this quiz. So definitely know what the female gonad is and the parts of the female reproductive system. and know where fertilization usually occurs, and what portion of the uterus is different portion of the uterus and what they actually do. You know, the endometrium and the myometrium and the perimetrium, and then know how the mammary glands work and the mammary ducts and what the mammary glands do, what they're used for, and actually know the stages of the ovarian cycle. So the ovarian cycle, let's go through them real quick. We didn't go through that in the slides a whole lot, but let's go through them real quick. You know that uh, the stage of the ovarian cycle, you start with the primordial follicle. So this is the development of the egg. So you get a primordial follicle, then you get a primary follicle, then you get a secondary follicle, then you get a tertiary follicle, then you get a ruptured follicle, and then you get a corpus luteum that's produced, and then you get a corpus albicans. So those are the stages of the ovarian cycle. Know those. And then know what estrogen and progesterone, what they do, why they're very important, and know what triggers the ovulation. You know that comes from, you know, the anterior pituitary producing a lot of LH. You get that surge and estrogen surge, you get ovulation. So know the phases of the menstrual cycle. So, you know, you have the uh, proliferative phase, the secretory phase, the luteal phase, the menstrual phase. So you have pre-ovulatory, post-ovulatory. So proliferative is pre-ovulatory. The secretory is post-ovulatory. Then you have a luteal phase and you have menstrual phase. Know the different phases and what actually happens during those different phases. Okay, and then know, you know, what happens during puberty and the hormones that are expressed and what actually happens during that time. And just in general, know, you know, types of birth control. The you know, a couple different types, but mainly the barrier methods, and just know that there are different methods and types, but definitely the barrier methods and types of barrier methods. Okay, so barrier methods, you could have, you know, like condoms and diaphragms, cervical caps. That includes even a sponge. That's a barrier method. Stop the sperm from getting where they want to get. Okay, well, do well. I'll look forward to seeing you soon.